I slid down the shower wall, and the tiles were cold against the back of my knees, and through the steam I could see my sister's silhouette in the doorway like a dark photograph hung against the light. She didn't come in. She didn't reach for me. She stood there with her arms folded, watching me like she was waiting for the timer to ding. I remember thinking, in that hot, dizzy fog, that it had become almost theatrical. My collapse, her watchful stillness, and then a small, furious part of me thought, when did my life turn into a scene she could study? I dragged myself up and leaned my forehead against the cool glass, the shampoo stinging my eyes. I could hear her heels on the kitchen tile, the soft tap of her phone, always that phone, always something to read instead of listening. She said, without surprise, "You should have called me." Not a question. A verdict. Why would I do that? I said. My voice was thin. My mouth tasted like metal. "I'm fine." Her laugh was the kind that belonged in a room that was always warmer than mine. "You always say that." She helped, in the way one helps a stranger on a train, with clipped, efficient motions. She wrapped a fluffy towel around me and handed me a glass of water that felt like it came from a different life. I thought of the mason jar on my kitchen counter, the one I'd kept since my husband's last toothy grin. It still held a few pennies and a coin or two from a trip we took to Maine 50 years ago. I had promised myself I would never ask anyone to know how to count those coins for me. "You should let me stay the night," she said casually as she sat at my kitchen table. The table where my chipped mug, the one with "World's Best Nana" in a font I'd bought with a coupon, steamed faintly, its handle warm under my shaky fingers. "Why?" I asked. The word came out small and suspicious because I knew the right answer, because she liked the idea of arranging people like furniture, because she liked knowing the layout of a house before she rearranged the pictures on the wall. She looked away from me then, a little impatient. "Because you're old, Mary. You're 82. You faint every Wednesday. It's practical. I'll make sure you don't fall and break anything." She said the number like a fact, 82, as if it were a plate to be set at the table. She had never called me Mary in private. It was always Mama when I wanted comfort and Mommy when I wanted forgiveness. This name felt like a label. The first time it happened, the first Wednesday, I told myself it was dizziness from too much heat, or the new medication that the doctor put me on after I told him I was slipping in the tub. He wrote the prescription on March 12, 2025 and told me to cut down on salt. "We'll keep an eye on it," he said. "If it continues, we'll run some tests." I put the slip of paper in my back pocket. I put it in the drawer with the old letters, the ones smelling faintly of lavender, and the pearls that my mother gave me when I married my husband in a tiny parlor lined with free newspapers. The pearls were small, a little dull from years of dust, but when I held them, the world softened. They were mine. She mentioned my arthritis only once, in that first week, and then again in passing, like a weather report. "You know, Mary, at our age, things start to go." She said it with a shrug. Like a store clerk saying, "No returns." My ordinary world, the one full of boiled coffee and late afternoon soap operas, the rocking chair by the window where I mended my grandson's scout hat, felt like a small island surrounded by a different ocean. I loved that island. I had built it with creature comforts and routine, the chipped mug on the corner of the sink, the mason jar with coins and a note that read, "For rainy days," written in my husband's sloped hand, the quilt my sister-in-law had given me that smelled like lavender and thread. These things were the map of my life. They told me where I belonged. When my sister came by, I noticed the way she glanced at those objects, the half-second of condescension when she looked at the jar of pennies. "You should cash that in," she said once, shaking her head. "Get something a little more sensible than coins under a jar." I remember my chest tightening. I loved those pennies because they were his. I loved the way they rattled when I moved the jar, and the way the sunlight turned them into little suns. That first Wednesday, I let her go home after she fussed a while. She kissed my forehead like you kiss a child's scraped knee and said she'd check in the next day. I pressed the pearls back into their little velvet square. I dried the chipped mug and put it carefully on the shelf. 2 days later, my neighbor Ruth brought over a recipe she'd torn from a magazine, apple pie with a secret crust, and I wrote the date on the top of the page, April 3rd, 2 days before the neighborhood gala. I was proud that I'd be making the pie. It was a small thing, but it's those small things that stitch a person to the world. Ruth sat at my table and asked me about my daughter. "How is Denise?" she said, and I felt a warmth in my chest because Denise had always been her indulgent girl, the one who sent pictures of her yacht. I had loved Denise in a noisy, grateful way. She'd given me a granddaughter named Tess, who used to rip the seams off my dresses with abandon. "Denise will be coming to the gala," I told Ruth, which was true, sort of. I didn't say that Denise hardly called anymore. I didn't say that there had been a coldness between us since the funeral. I swallowed the lump and changed the subject. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my rocking chair and listened to the houses breathe. In the lamplight, the pearls looked almost right as they were, a halo I could still reach for. The second Wednesday, the collapse was worse. I remember waking with a splitting headache and my hands trembling so badly I nearly tipped over my chipped mug. I clutched at the edge of the sink, and the world swam like a carnival ride. I tried to stand, and my knees buckled. My sister arrived before I could consider calling, before I could gather the courage to turn my face to the wall and cry. She knocked once, not the kind of soft knock you give when you visit to borrow sugar, but the firm, practice tap you use when you know the person inside is fragile. When she walked in, she had her designer coat slung over one arm and a look that said she had better things to do than worry. "Again," she said, setting her purse down with care, as if the purse could balance the day. She called Dr. Hargrove on speakerphone. He listened, polite and practiced, and suggested the hospital might be best. He used words like safety and observation. I felt a little anger rise, and I told him I was fine, that I'd sit this one out. I could hear the smaller voice inside me. "We are tired, but we are not done." The drive to the hospital was another kind of exposure. My sister talked about her charity gala, the paint color she wanted for the foyer, the new assistant who had come from a place where answers were never delayed. "You should come with me to the gala," she said. "We can make sure you're seen." "Seen?" I asked. "Seen how?" "Not seen like an old lady," she said, a practiced smile. "Seen as someone who belongs to a circle. We belong to different circles." Her circle was marble, crystal, engraved invitations. Mine was the PTA bake sale, the church bingo, the parking lot where I had once hugged my husband before he left for a night shift that turned into a lifetime. I did not belong to marble. I belonged to the smell of yeast rising on a Sunday morning, to the scratch of a pen on a birthday card. At the hospital, they ran tests. The nurse took blood and recorded my vitals like a nurse reading from a hymn. The lab results were a little off, but nothing dramatic. The doctor suggested monitoring for the next week. My sister nodded, yes, sure, such a sensible plan. Later, at home, while I sat under my quilt and listened to the hum of the refrigerator as if it were the town clock, my sister opened a drawer I had always kept locked, the one with the old insurance cards, the mortgage papers from when my husband and I bought this place in 1979, and the letters from my mother. I'd never worried about keeping it open. It was more habit than secrecy. But my sister touched the edges of the papers like a woman who measures everything by its edges for folding. I watched her hands. They were manicured and fast. "You keep everything," she said. "Even that old life." I felt my jaw tighten. "It's my life," I said. "It's our history." She shrugged. "Paper isn't history, Mary. Paper is a mess until someone organizes it." She started taking photos of the papers with her phone. I asked her what she was doing, and she said she was making a list. I peered, and for a moment, my heart dropped because she had photographed a small yellowed envelope with, "For Mary when I pass," in my mother's handwriting. "My mother's letter?" I said. She smiled in that tight way and said, "Just making sure everything's in order." The next day, an envelope with a city seal arrived addressed to me. Inside was a notice, a scheduled hearing at the county mediator's office, nothing dangerous. Or at least that's what it said. It was dated May 8th. I put the notice on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a red apple, a gift from a niece who thought little kitchen whims were everything. The notice felt like a pebble, small, but it rolled. A week later, I went to see the lawyer, a man named Mr. Landry, whom my husband had met at a Rotary Club meeting in 1985. He smelled faintly of cigar and peppermint. His office had shelves of books with gold letters that shone when light hit them. He held a document called Durable Power of Attorney in his hands, like it was a baton. He explained in careful language that this document would let a trusted person make decisions for me if I was unable to. And it's common for families to choose someone trustworthy, he said. Someone local. I laughed at the word common because I have always been uncommon in my stubbornness. Who have you in mind? I asked. He glanced down at his notes and said, often a spouse, an adult child, or a close relative. I said nothing because in that moment I heard my sister's voice like a bell. I thought of that velvet square with the pearls. I thought of the mason jar and the coin that caught the light if I turned it just so. I thought of the chipped mug. I'll think about it, I said. My sister sat in the leather chair, legs crossed, and whispered something about streamlining the process. She fished out her phone and, in the way that people do who are used to taking charge, suggested she would handle the paperwork for me. You wouldn't want anything to be left to chance, she put it plainly, and I agreed because it seemed the easiest thing to do. I signed the initial forms, consent forms, preliminary checks, and left with a sense like dropping something small into a river. At home, the radio played a familiar tune, and I could hear a young voice calling from the television in the room next door. I made tea, and the chipped mug felt like an old hand. I tried to tell myself I had made the choice because it was practical, because the world is practical at 82. But a small, stubborn part of me kept thinking, whose practicality? That night, I opened the velvet box and took out the pearls. I ran them through my fingers and remembered the day my husband pressed them into my palm. For when you want to feel like the girl I fell in love with, he said then. And I laughed because pearls don't make you younger. They just make you remember a different face in the mirror. I found a small folded note underneath the pearls. It was in my mother's handwriting. Mary, if you're reading this, remember to keep your voice, always. The words were like a lighthouse in fog. I held them to my chest and felt very small and very fierce. At the end of the second week, my sister began to stop by more often. Not the pleasant, neighborly drops. These were systematic, scheduled visits. She sometimes stood by the sink while I washed the dishes and would rearrange the magnets on the refrigerator. These need updating, she said. These are old memories, Mary. Her voice was soft, but it felt like removing stitches. My friend Ruth called me, worried, and asked if I was all right. I told her I was fine. After I hung up, I stood by the window and watched my sister's car disappear down the street like a swallow leaving for the summer. I had a dream where the mason jar rolled off the counter and spilled its coins across the floor, and a hand I did not recognize scooped them up. I woke with the taste of pennies in my mouth. One afternoon, I reached for my mother's letter, and it was gone. The velvet box opened top to bottom, and there was a blank square of velvet where the note should have been. I sat on the kitchen chair, and my hands shook so badly I almost spilled the tea. I never thought she'd take it. I never expected what I found in that drawer. Dumas once said that every wrong carries within it the seed of its own undoing. I think he meant that the more crooked the path, the more likely it will lead into a clearing where the sun can see. I do not know if the clearing will feel like mercy or exposure, but I know the sun does not favor shadows forever. I turned my head when I heard the knock at the door. A sound I had expected, but in a tone I had not. I felt the world narrow to the kitchen chair and the empty velvet square where my mother's letter used to lie. My hands hovered over the tea, and then, like a machine finding a stuck gear, I got up and went to the back door. The mail slot clacked as though it wanted to say something, and the late afternoon light flattered the dust motes into little slow dancers. I thought of the mason jar on my counter. I thought of the pearls. I thought of the magnet on the refrigerator that read, "Family is everything." I laughed once, a small, incredulous sound, because I realized family could be everything and nothing at the same time. I called my sister. Her voice answered on the second ring as if she'd been waiting for it. "Hello?" she said. It was casual, like the drawer she'd opened. "Where is my mother's letter?" I asked. My voice shook with that particular kind of anger that is more sorrow than heat. There was a soft scuff of fabric. "What letter, Mary?" "The one that says, 'If you're reading this, keep your voice.'" "Oh," she said, sounding momentarily surprised. "I must have put it with the documents when I was taking inventory. Aren't you glad someone's doing that for you? We can't leave things to chance." "Inventory?" The word felt wrong. "What documents?" She named them as if reading from an agenda. Insurance policies, bank statements, your mortgage papers, the durable power of attorney form Mr. Landry mentioned. "You remember, the one we agreed would be good to have." We hadn't agreed on a thing. I could feel the memory of the leather chair in Mr. Landry's office, the way he'd held out that phrase, durable power of attorney, like a helpful pamphlet. I'd been willing to consider it. But someone had turned consideration into completion without my knowing. My stomach dipped. "Promise me you'll find it," she said. "I'll stop by after my meeting." She came with a smile that was all business jewelry and the faint smell of citrus from her dry cleaner. She opened drawers and cupboards with a neat authority, taking photos with her phone of the mortgage documents and the old insurance card, tapping the screen and saying, "There, see? Organized." When she touched the velvet box and found the pearls, there was a flicker, a small, human thing. She put the pearls in the velvet and closed it like a woman who knew the right number to dial and how to listen while she dialed. "You should put these somewhere safe," she said. "Do you have a safe?" I told her I did not. I had a cedar chest beneath the window where quilts slept folded like patient animals. She suggested a bank box, and I nodded because it felt like a sensible idea. I could have suggested she leave. My things alone, I suppose, but sense has a tendency to bow to the practical when nerves are raw. That night, I drove to the bank. I know it sounds strange to say I drove myself. I shouldn't have, but I wanted to see for myself. The fluorescent lights of the bank made everything white and honest. I told the teller I would like to review recent transactions and the list of authorized signers on my accounts. The teller, a young woman with a name tag that said April, typed and smiled the way people do when they keep their sympathies to the size of the lobby. "Everything looks normal," April said, then frowned at the screen. "Except..." She tilted the screen toward me. There, in stark print, was a line that made my heart do a slow, surprised flip. "Durable power of attorney, Agent L. Hart, executed 04/22/2025, Notary S. Clemens, Notary Public, Doc ID 8342ML. My name, Mary Thompson, and beneath it a little signature that could have been mine if the hand had been taught in a different lifetime. Except the date was April 22nd, and I had not signed anything that day. I sat back in the chair like someone who had been winded by a door slamming. "Who is L. Hart?" I asked, thinking of my sister's full name, Lorraine Hart. "Yes," April said softly. "An L. Hart is listed as the POA, and there was a withdrawal from your checking account on 04/23/2025, $10,000, cashier's check issued to L. Hart." My fingers found the pecan wood of the chair. I tasted metal in my mouth, fear sharpened like a fork. The mason jar rolled in my memory as if someone had nudged it. My sister said she was organizing things. My bank said that somebody with papers and a notary had become my agent. I walked home with the back of my neck hot. The porch light hummed. The air smelled like cut grass and the faint garlic scent from a neighbor's kitchen. I found my phone on the counter and called Mr. Landry. He answered, and the familiarity of his voice, the peppermint clinging to it, made me feel ridiculous and also, strangely, less alone. "Mary," he said, then a pause. "Is everything all right? Did I sign a durable power of attorney on April 22nd? I asked. He inhaled as if to steady a question he'd been waiting to ask. "Your file shows a POA filed on the 22nd, yes. It lists Lorraine Hart as your agent. It's notarized. But that's not what I have on my drafts. You had asked for information about a POA. We didn't finalize anything. Why would they filed it? I said. Who filed it? He asked me to come by the office. I found that I could drive, though I suspected my hands would not be steady. The Rotary Club photos on the wall blinked in the spring sun as if they were watching for the moment a story would unspool. In his office, Mr. Landry spread the papers. He had 2 copies now, one in the file and one in his hand. The signatures were close, but not the same. The notarization was in S. Clemens's hand, and if I squinted, I could see where the pressure was heavier in a few strokes, as if the pen had been leaned on. Forgeries tend to have certain telltale signs, he said. Different pressure, unusual letter formation. If you hadn't been present, that's not necessarily evidence of incapacity. But forgery, falsification of a signature, is a criminal matter. My throat tightened. Can someone do that, sign for me, and then go to the bank with it? Yes, he said. People do, especially when someone's health is declining, or the appearance of decline is arranged. Arranged? He didn't say it out loud, but the room filled for a moment with the shape of a sentence, staged collapses, a conveniently signed document, a quiet withdrawal. I remembered the Wednesdays. I remembered the faintness like stage smoke and my sister standing in the doorway. I remembered the cough, the tightness in my chest. I felt like a puppet who had only just realized there were hands pulling the strings. Dumas wrote, Mr. Landry said quietly, that a man's fortune often reveals the true nature of those closest to him. Might I suggest we treat this as a matter both civil and criminal? We can file a petition to set aside the power of attorney for lack of capacity and present evidence that the signature is forged. We can seek a temporary restraining order to prevent your assets from being moved. How long will that take? I asked. The practicality in his voice was the same as the smell of his office. Orderly, efficient. It can take weeks to months, he said. We'll want a forensic document examiner. Their initial fee, retainer, is around $5,000. The court can freeze accounts temporarily if we file an emergency motion. He looked at me as if searching for a ledger of courage. And Mary, if we can show a pattern that someone stood to gain, the county prosecutor may open a criminal investigation. A retainer of $5,000. The idea sat in my head like a marble. I had money, a savings account I'd poured pennies into over decades, a house that showed the polite equity of a lifetime of mortgage payments. But the idea of paying out for a battle against my own blood made my stomach ache. I remember Mr. Landry's hand on the file. I won't lie. These cases are ugly, and they break families. He said it with a softness that made me feel a little ridiculous for the hot feeling that rose in my chest like gasoline. But the law is not a tool for thieves. If someone acted in bad faith, we can make them answer. I left the office and the world felt louder. The air on Main Street was a little too bright. I drove home with my jaw set the way my father's did when he expected a fight at the table. When I stepped through my front door, there was a note on my counter in my daughter's handwriting, Denise's blocky letters, that read, "Stop making things hard. I'm helping, D." The note felt like a slap. Helping. I folded it and put it in my pocket because I didn't have the courage to throw it away yet. I started to watch, not the world at large, but my own small kingdom. I watched the stair tread, the way my sister placed her palm on the banister as if measuring out her path. I watched the way she answered the phone and lowered it when I came into the room. I watched her fingers move over the photographs on the mantel, the pictures of my husband and me at a county fair, his arms slung around me and my hair a different color. Then one day, while she was away at some luncheon with people whose names were gilded, I opened her purse. I know that sounds wrong. It felt wrong and right in equal measure. There were receipts, a lipstick, a key ring with a house-shaped fob, and a folded note. I unfolded the note and my breath left me. It was an email printout dated April 21st, 2025, from an address that could only be Denise's, denise.mhartydomain.com. Subject line, POA confirmed, plan set for RO422. The email said, plainly, Lorraine, remember, we do Wednesdays. Keep her weak and forgetful. Make the collapses routine. The notary is ready on the 22nd at 10 a.m. S. Clemens won't ask questions. We'll have the forms. Cash needs to be moved on the 23rd to avoid paper trails. I have Tess in case we need her as a witness. Keep the pearls. It softens her. My hands went numb, as if the world had been dipped in cold. Tess, my granddaughter, became a utility in a sentence I had not agreed to. My knees felt hollow. There was the sound of a key in the lock, and I snapped the printout back into the purse, like a woman slapping a postcard into an envelope that belonged to someone else. My sister walked in with shopping bags balanced like trophies. She smelled faintly of perfume and the air from outside. I found this, I said, and my voice came out as a thin thing. She shrugged. Old receipts. I held up the printout anyway. Her face flickered and then smoothed. Where did you get that? She asked too calmly. It was tucked in your purse. You were in my things? She said it with a mix of hurt and accusation that was practiced. Mary, you're not yourself. You knew about the POA, I said. You and Denise. She laughed that little laugh that I had come to detest. Oh, Mary, you make conspiracies. Denise is thinking about the future. She helped make sure that you'd be cared for. Cared for how? I said. By signing a paper I never signed. You signed it, she said with sudden certainty. We were in the room. Don't play coy, Mary. I opened my mouth and closed it again. My memory clips were jagged with fog. There were Wednesdays. There were knocks. There were hospital lights. But there was no memory of sitting and signing a POA. And yet, I had the image of a pen under pressure in a handwriting sample. Mr. Landry had said, forgery. The moral of this moment struck me then, not as a wise saying, but as a hard truth. Betrayal, once practiced, grows more confident. The knife that sits by the table will cut whether you use it or not, my mother used to say. The saying felt suddenly literal. I hired the forensic document examiner the next morning. Her name was Dr. Elaine Morales, and she smelled faintly of lavender and had a laugh that began in her chest and bubbled out as if she found the world both ridiculous and fixable. She had the machine that could measure ink pressure and the way a letter leaned. She set my mother's handwriting beside the alleged signature and ran her fingers over the paper like a seamstress. I'll need originals, she said, and permission to photograph everything. These analyses take time, but they're dispositive more often than not. I gave her the envelope with my mother's script and the velvet square where the pearls had sat. Dr. Morales looked at the pearls and said, Jewelry often turns up in places people least expect. It's symbolic, and sometimes symbolic theft accompanies legal forgery. When I told her about the email and the cashier's check for $10,000, she pursed her lips. A pattern, she said. Small withdrawals to test, then larger moves. The $10,000 could be a test transaction. If it clears, they'll take more. They did. Over the next 2 weeks, withdrawals and transfers appeared like a terrible crop. $10,000 more here. A $5,000 cashier's check to a shell company she didn't recognize. Charges at a jeweler for an appraisal that made no sense. I counted it in the quiet of the night, and the sum began to look like a weight. $73,200 gone in small, precise cuts. The house showed equity of about $230,000 on a market estimate I had asked Mr. Landry to check, which made me feel both wealthy and poor in the same breath. My internal battle roared like a small storm. I loved my daughter. I had held her while she learned to walk and mended her prom dress and baked pies for her children. But courage is sometimes the decision to stop pretending you're okay. One night, I heard them on the phone, my sister and Denise, speaking in a rhythm of plans, as if we were a stage set and not a life. I stood by the stair and heard Lorraine's voice low and sure. It's moving on schedule. Mary's week on Wednesdays. We'll have the witness. Tess is pliable. Denise laughed, a thin sound. We have to go slow. The family will suspect if it's too sudden. My heart slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird. I remembered the mason jar rolling, the pearls hidden. The note, "Stop making things hard." I thought of Tess, and a pain so deep it felt like an animal began to gnaw. That was the moment I stopped being willing to be moved. I asked Mr. Landry to file an emergency motion. He did not hesitate. He prepared a petition to set aside the POA on grounds of forgery and undue influence and requested a temporary restraining order to freeze the accounts, dated May 3, 2025. He insisted I would need a sworn affidavit detailing the forced collapses and the email. I sat at my kitchen table and wrote the affidavit with a hand that trembled but did not give way. I included dates: March 12, 2025, doctor's visit. April 22, 2025, POA filed. April 23, 2025, $10,000 withdrawal. April 30, 2025, email printout found. I signed and dated it May 4th. There was a point where the love of a mother and a lifetime of habit tugged hard. I thought back to kissing a forehead in a hospital room and to the time Denise had been small and soaked her hair in the bathtub until I had to fish her out and laugh. Could I really go after my daughter in court? Yes, I answered myself, I could. Because there are things that love must not excuse. When love becomes a ledger, it starts to feel like debt. Mr. Landry warned me the next steps would be ugly and public. He told me the county mediator's office had a scheduled hearing on May 8th, a notice I had received earlier. But the moment we filed the emergency motion, the banks placed a hold and the county prosecutor took a preliminary interest. He told me to prepare for denials, for heartfelt speeches, for tears arranged like practiced protests. The hardest part, he said softly, is that they will call you ungrateful. They will say you are confused. It is easier for families to accept a lie than to face the truth. I remember thinking of my mother's hand on my cheek when I was a child, and how she told me to speak when injustice brushed me. The Dumas aside rose in me, a sentence that had no right to be poetic but was. Betrayals bloom in the dark but cannot stay hidden forever. Truth is a lantern too stubborn for the night. I had the filing certificate in my hand like a shield. I had paid the retainer for Dr. Morales and signed the emergency affidavit. I had asked the bank to freeze transactions on May 5th. At home, I sat in my chair and felt a fatigue older than my years come on like a winter coat. My phone buzzed with a message from Denise. "Mary, stop this. You're embarrassing us. You're making a scene," I answered, with a steadiness I did not always feel. I am not embarrassed. I am alive. There was a new sound at my door the next morning. Not the measured knock of Lorraine, but the deep, official thump of someone used to speaking with authority. I opened the door, and a sheriff's deputy stood there, neat as a pin. Behind him were two men in suits I had never seen, and a woman with a badge clipped to her belt. "Ms. Thompson?" the deputy asked. "We're with the county prosecutor's office. We have a few questions about recent transactions." I let them in. The house smelled like tea and the faint residue of lavender. They set their notebooks down like flowers on a grave and began to read lists I had already read in my bank statements. They asked me to recount the emails, the dates, the patterns. I told them. I watched the way their pens moved, steady and clean. "Has anyone coerced you into signing anything?" the prosecutor asked. "No," I said, which was true. "But someone has forged my signature." They looked at each other, a small exchange, like a breeze passing a field. "We'll open an inquiry," the deputy said. "This may become a criminal matter." I felt a curious calm settle. The law spoke plainly, and it was listening. That calm was tempered by fear, because the world had shifted, and I had stepped onto ground that could shake. I called my daughter after they left. Her voice on the phone was tight. "Mary, what did you do?" she asked. "I filed," I said simply. "You'll ruin us," she said. "You'll ruin everything." "Not everything," I said. "Not yet." Her silence was a small, cold thing. "You don't have to be this way, Mom," she said finally. "Yes, I do," I said. "I have to be." I hung up and walked to the window. The street was ordinary, a dog being walked, a man putting out a newspaper. I felt absurdly proud and terrified at the same time. I thought of the pearls, the mason jar, the chipped mug. I thought of my mother's note, "Keep your voice." It felt less like counsel and more like a command that had rippled through generations. That night, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a courier with a thin envelope and a form. Inside was a letter from the courthouse. Notice of temporary restraining order hearing, May 12, 2025. 9 a.m., emergency motion to freeze assets filed May 5th, and beneath it, another paper that made my fingers cold. A summons for me to appear at the bank the following morning because Lorraine Hart had filed a counter motion for the release of funds necessary for caretaking expenses. The counter motion made me feel naked, like a shawl had been taken off me. The idea that a caregiver might need caretaking expenses while simultaneously withdrawing my money felt like a bad joke, except it was not funny. I had made a choice. I had told the law what I believed. I had asked for help. And at the same time, I felt the world contracting, like a fist closing. I went to sleep with my hand on the pearls beneath my pillow, as if the weight would remind me I was not alone. The next morning, there would be hearings and papers and men in suits and lawyers with calendars that looked like battleground maps. I lay there and thought of the small, brave things I had done. Taken a bus to a town meeting, baked a pie for a school fundraiser, signed my name at the bottom of a letter that would not be the last. And then, just before I drifted, my phone buzzed with a message from Tess. "I heard," it said. I don't know what to do. I felt the world shift again. My hands trembled, but for the first time, the tremor felt like purpose rather than fear. I would not be erased. There was a sound at the door. Not a knock this time, but a key. Someone was not patient enough to wait for my answer. The lock turned slowly, with the calm of someone who had a plan and the arrogance of someone who believes plans are theirs alone. I heard a voice say my name, low and certain, from the other side of the door. The key turned and the lock made that long, slow sound like a tired clock, and for a little second I thought the world would bite the dust in the way old things do when you first let go. The voice on the other side, Lorraine's, slipped in like a chill draft. "Mary," she said, soft as smoke. "Open up, we need to talk." I stood with the pearls cupped in my palm, the velvet warm from where I'd kept it under the pillow, and I thought of all the small, faithful things that had marked my life. The chipped mug, the mason jar clinking with change, the porch light that I turned on every evening at dusk. I felt years settle into my bones like coins. I opened the door. There were more people than I expected, not men in suits only, but a deputy I recognized from the county station and a woman from the prosecutor's office with a look like someone who had learned to keep calm for the sake of others. Lorraine stood between them with a purse slung low, her shoulders squared as if she were already in front of an audience. "You have no right," she said, the sentences tight as piano wire. The deputy lifted a warrant and read it softly, like a prayer. "Ms. Hart, you are under investigation for alleged forgery, fraud, and undue influence. We are here to ask some questions, and if necessary, collect items relevant to the investigation." Lorraine's face flickered from indignation to something close to guile. "This is harassment," she said, though there was the tremble in her hand that told a different story. I watched her. For so many years we had shared recipes and birthdays and the same strange, stubborn genes that made us prefer coffee with a little too much sugar. But this Lorraine, the woman who'd stood in my doorway and watched me collapse like a scene in someone else's life, was a stranger who knew my house. "Well, you'll have to come with us," the deputy said finally. He was gentle with the way he spoke, the way people can be when the duty is heavy. Lorraine's mouth thinned. She turned once toward me, and for a bare moment something like a daughter peered through the mask. "You don't have to do this," she mouthed, but I had already decided. The toast of my life had burned on more than one side. I had learned the taste, and I would not pretend I did not smell it. They did not make a scene in my living room. They asked calm questions, collected a few documents, and left with Lorraine in tow. The house felt too empty afterward, like the kettle after a cup of tea has been poured out. My heart pounded in a rhythm I recognized from wedding marches and funerals. The county prosecutor called the next day. "We've opened a preliminary inquiry," he said. "There's enough for further investigation. We'll talk about charges after we review the evidence." Every time someone said investigation, I felt my life being put under a lens. Every small scuff and nick catalogued and examined. It was a particular kind of humiliation, like wearing a dress that fit only for the photographs. The forensic report came in on May 9th, bound and smelling faintly of printer ink and official seals. Dr. Morales' analysis was clear in her quiet, scientific way. The pressure patterns and the slant of several letters in the durable power of attorney signature strayed from my own. The ink composition matched the pen found in Lorraine's purse, the one I had looked at and nearly thrown away the day I rifled through her bag. The email printout, dated April 21st, was authenticated through IP traces to an account under Denise's name, with corroborating metadata showing it had been printed from a computer registered to the Hart residence. The numbers were blunt. Unromantic things: $10,000 on April 23rd, $5,000 on April 30th, $3,200 here and there, total $73,200 over the month. A cashier's check for $10,000 to L. Hart had cleared on April 23rd. A second cashier's check for $15,000 had been issued on May 1st to a jeweler in the next county. My house's equity, about $230,000 according to the market estimate Mr. Landry had obtained on May 6th, shimmered like a too-big prize I hadn't wanted to win. When the prosecutor's office called Lauren Hart, Lorraine's assistant at the charity, she had said, "I didn't know it would go that far," which is a phrase you hear a lot when people set out small lies that grow large. "Tell us about the Wednesdays," the detective said to me the morning. I drove to the station with my chiffon scarf pressed in my pocket like a talisman. "They were small collapses at first," I said. "Fainting spells, hospital lights, comfort, a towel wrapped around my shoulders. It all looked like care. And the other evidence?" she asked. My voice was steadier than I expected. "An email with instructions, cashier's checks, withdrawals timed after the collapses, photos of my papers taken by Lorraine, the pearls missing for a time." I let the words fall like coins into a jar. The prosecutor was blunt in the way the law must be. "We have enough to move forward with charges," he said. "Forgery, theft, and conspiracy. We'll indict Ms. Hart and we'll present the evidence against anyone who aided in the scheme." Denise's name had appeared in the emails. Her note on my counter: "Stop making things hard. I'm helping." D was a small, mortal thing I'd kept folded in my pocket like a confession. I stood in a courthouse hallway and felt my past life drip into the grout of the present. Birthdays, scoldings, the softness of my hands on a small child's hair, and wondered how those soft things could be used like tools. The arraignment was on May 22nd. The courtroom smelled of old wood and varnish, like a church where confessions repeat. Lorraine wore a suit that spoke of charity galas and careful public images. She kept her expression taut, like someone who has practiced sorrow in the mirror, when the prosecutor played the recorded interview from April 21st, a clip of Denise's voice, coordinating times and instructing someone to keep her week on Wednesdays. The room shifted. Tess was there, her small shoulders folded into a jacket that seemed too big for the girl. She watched the proceedings like a child at a magic show, eyes wide and not sure whether the trick was gone or real. Lorraine's attorney argued their version in low, clipped sentences: caregiving expenses, practical decisions, an elderly woman who was confused. They suggested I had misunderstood, that a POA was a reasonable thing in modern life. They painted themselves with the brush of sensible family concern. The prosecutor set out the paper trail, the cashier's checks, the withdrawals timed to the collapses, the email printout, the forensic report. He asked Tess a question that made the hair at the back of my neck stand up. "Tess," he asked, "did you witness your mother and grandmother together on April 22nd? The girl swallowed. Her voice came out thin. "I went to the house that day to babysit," she said. "I was supposed to be downstairs. My mom told me to go upstairs and play. I heard voices. I was in the hallway and I saw Aunt Lorraine sign something. I thought it was a form. My mom told me to go back to the playroom." Her testimony was small and imperfect, like a child's crayon line, but it held weight. The prosecutor let the weight stay heavy in the room for as long as it needed to. Part of me wanted to forgive. Old reflexes, bones softened by years of giving. But justice is a thing that grows impatient when neglected. Forgiveness is a gift, not an obligation. Loving a child who has done wrong does not erase the wrong. I had a Dumas thought then, a lofty thing in ordinary clothes. Wrongs, when tended and hidden, thicken like a stew left on for too long. When the lid is lifted, the smell can no longer be denied. The law asks us to lift the lid for the sake of truth. It is not cruelty, it is sunlight. When the jury returned a month later, the decision was quiet and then final. Lorraine Hart, guilty on counts of forgery and theft. Denise Hart, accessory to theft and conspiracy, a lesser count given her cooperation. Restitution ordered in the amount of $73,200, plus fees and court costs. And, in a turn I had not expected to savor as much as I did, an order that Lorraine be barred from handling my financial affairs or contacting me for a period of 3 years, pending supervised restitution payments. She stood when the bailiff read it. For a moment, I glimpsed the woman who had been my sister, then the public figure she had become. Outside the courthouse, the cameras, the small local ones, nothing like the charity gala's lights, showed. Her face in the headlines read like the small-town sermons that end in hallelujahs. There was a peculiar sort of quiet justice in how the world rearranged itself after that. Lorraine's charity gala was rescheduled. Sponsors stepped back. The invitation lists were quietly rewritten. The people with polished smiles took other seats. She shrank in ways that had nothing to do with her height. The house felt different after the trial. My porch light shone the same way, and the chipped mug still held tea. The mason jar still clinked. But the world had a new order. The bank unfroze the remaining accounts in my name and returned the $73,200 through a court-ordered restitution trust. The cashier's checks had been tracked, and some assets were recovered. Mr. Landry negotiated a settlement that included payment for the forensic report, $5,000 retainer, legal fees, and a small compensation for the emotional harm. The award was not the stuff of novels, but it was enough to remind me that the law can be a broom sometimes, sweeping the dust from the corners. Denise came to me after the verdict, and she cried in a way that was both private and theatrical. "Mom," she said, "I'm sorry." Her hands were shaking. "I thought we were doing what was best. I thought it was complicated." "You thought you were protecting me," I said. "Instead, you were protecting a plan." She looked smaller than any old photograph I had tucked away. "I felt trapped," she whispered. "Heaping pressure. I thought it was the only way to get help for you." "You should have come to me," I said. "You could have asked. You could have sat down and listened." She nodded and folded into herself like a woman who had been learning that the world does not always bend to protect family illusions. She would be required to make restitution, too, and the prosecutor had given her a chance at a lesser sentence because she had cooperated with the inquiry. Tess, my girl with the jacket too big, came by the week after the restitution was arranged. She held a small envelope, and inside was a note in pencil. "I'm sorry, Nana. I didn't know what to do. I love you." She slid the note into my hand with the clumsy reverence of a child offering a found treasure. I took the paper and smelled the faint dust of a school locker on it. "You did what you could," I told her. "You told the truth." She sat on my porch in the late sun, and we ate pie, whose crust was imperfect and delicious. She spoke of school, and of friends, and of the way she felt awkward at the reading circles that used to be part of our family rhythm. I told her stories of her mother as a child, the way Denise used to hide under blankets and recite poems she'd heard on the radio. Tess's eyes gleamed like a new penny, and for the first time in a long time, she looked like a real part of my life rather than a prop. People ask me sometimes if vengeance felt sweet. It did not. There was no sweetness in seeing a sister led away in a different life. There was sorrow and a curious relief that truth had a place at the table. I felt lighter in a way. That surprised me, as if someone had cut a rope I didn't realize had been tied to my ankle. The restitution did not return all of what was lost. Jewelry sold, some checks spent on things that could not be tracked. But my house remained mine. The bank placed the title in a trust in my name only, a small legal fence that meant they could not touch my house without court order. The durable power of attorney was set aside, officially void as of May 22, 2025. Mr. Landry made sure the record was clear, and I signed a new directive, a simple document that limited who could be involved in medical decisions: my doctor, a neutral trustee, and my name. I reinvented small things. I bought a new jar for pennies and labeled it with a little piece of masking tape that read, "For rainy days." I held the pearls against my throat and felt that little loop of memory like a ribbon. I sold a brooch I'd never worn to help pay Mr. Landry a portion of his fees and treated myself to a small, sensible radio with clearer reception. The pedal of normal life, grocery shopping, church meetings, the bingo table, felt like the thing I had been missing the most. People asked me how I managed the fear, how I endured the public stitches of a trial. Practicality, I told them with a half smile, and stubbornness. Also, the right file folders. They laughed because old women have a way of making humor a kind of armor. A week after everything settled, Lorraine sent a letter through her attorney requesting mediation for the restitution schedule. In it, she said the words you see in melodramas. She expressed regret and a desire to make amends. The prosecutor filed the restitution schedule, and the judge ordered payment plans tied to her income and assets. She would never regain the public, roles she'd once commanded. Invitations became absent, and the social phone stopped ringing. There is a small kind of justice that feels like a garden put back in order. Roots tended, soil turned, new saplings for future years. I found myself gardening my mailbox with new seeds of trust. I called Ruth and told her I was making a peach pie for the neighborhood picnic. She laughed like a woman who knew the world would not let me remain small for long, and I spoke to Denise again. We did not fix everything. We never did. But we sat quietly and mended what we could. She came over sometimes to help fold laundry. She brought her children and apologized before the meal had cooled. "I was scared," she told me once. "I thought we were saving you from the world." "You were saving someone from temptation," I said. "You know, there are times the bravest thing is to ask for help honestly." She stared at the chipped mug on the counter. "You could have had help," she said softly. "I had help," I told her. "I had myself." When I look back at those months, I see small, bright things like shards of glass. They cut, yes, but they reflect light too. The pearls still rest in a new velvet box inside a small bank safety deposit under my name alone. The mason jar sits on my counter, and when I shake it, the coins sound like a small parade. There are quieter victories, too. The neighbor who used to avert her eyes now smiles and asks for my recipe for apple pie. The bank manager, a man I'd known since my husband paid his mortgage, brought me extra forms just so I could sign with more control. He had a way of saying, "Nobody tells you what to do with your life but you." That felt like a benediction. People sometimes ask me if I forgave Lorraine. Forgiveness is not a single thing you put in your pocket and carry. It's a slow, careful process. I forgave insofar as I could accept that some people choose darkness when they think it will cover their fear. I cannot unchoose the love I had for my sister, but I can choose my boundaries. I can choose to protect my heart like a house with a strong lock. I find myself returning to my mother's note often. Keep your voice, always. It feels less a command now and more a guardrail. I taught Tess to read that line, and we used it as a small lesson. If something sounds like a path to shame, step out of it and ask. If my story touched you, share it with someone who needs courage today. And don't forget to subscribe. This old heart has many more truths yet to tell.